When the first settlers arrived on the North American shore, they saw an untamed land. And they saw many natives. And the first question on their mind was, who owned the land? And the English monarchy answered that question early on. And they said that the natives owned the land, and if you wanted it, you would have to buy it. However, the view among historians became that the colonization of North America was that the Indians did not have any property rights. And there's a lot of insights and opinions out there, and very few search the records. They just skim the surface. And it really does an injustice to the people on both sides. In this video series, I'm going to do an in-depth study of the historical records to see how the American natives lost their land. And then at the end of this video here, I'm going to put my resources up from where I get my studies from. Now, it'd be superficial to say that an aggressive European civilization with superior technology and firepower conquered a less aggressive civilization with inferior weapons. And few will search the depths of the records to get an intelligent understanding of actually what transpired. The leading environmental histories depicts the early colonization of the American natives' land as rationalizing their conquest by articles and essays. Like one, the moral and legal justification for disposing the Indian. And another one, the Puritans, justification for taking the land. Now, the most thorough study was probably done by Robert Williams, the American Indian in Western legal thought. But he came to the same conclusion,
that the American native
possessed no rights, and as a result, they could be dispossessed of their land. This view is also shared in American law. All students of property law, they learned the case of Johnson versus McIntosh. In 1825, the U.S. ruled that since the English monarchy did not recognize the Indians as having property rights, the U.S. will not either. Now, of course, that law is definitely being debated now and, probably may get overturned. But that's what was ruled in 1825, and that's what they still use today. Okay, after my study, I'm of the consensus that that may not be totally accurate. Now, with that being said, American Indian land ownership was never unanimously recognized by everyone. There were always some English colonists and even colonial governments that were willing to take land from the Indians without paying for it. All laws are violated sometimes, but this one seemed to be violated the most. As the population grew of the settlers, well, so did the demand for the Indian land. It doesn't say anything to the fact that the Indians were given a fair price, or that the Indians were losing their land had a great effect on their population.
So this is one theory we're going to look at in my video series, the justification for taking the land. Even though, generally speaking, the natives were recognized as the landowners. And another theory we're going to look at is the right to conquer. Now, among the English, there was nothing controversial about who was going to govern this land. The one was property rights. who owned the land. The Virginia Company at Jamestown, they struggled with this issue, and they knew a century earlier that the Spanish had the same issues dealing with the legality of the ownership of the land. And they also believed that this is what slowed their colonization of the land. But they knew it would not be long before the issues of sovereignty of this land would become hot topics in London. In 1609, William Crashaw, a minister in Jamestown, he said that a Christian may not take the heathen's land without a lawful and bargained agreement. But there was other ministers that preached that the problem of the colonists' thinking is that they believe it's unlawful to take land. But in fact, history is a large catalog of people conquering other people. I mean, the Hebrews did it, the Lacedaemonians did it, the Goths did it, the Greeks, the Romans. You could hardly do wrong with something that brought the Romans and the Greeks so much glory. And remember, the colonists, they were well aware a century before about their own conquest by the Normans. And they knew that England was just as rough and rugged as America was here. And the inhabitants as blind and barbarous as they were. But this asserted general right of conquest was no less controversial than the fact of a Christian taking a heathen's land. There was already international law that distinguished between the just and unjust taking and conquering other lands. It was understood that the simple desire of ones to acquire somebody else's land for an unjust cause was illegal. By 1665, it was noted that no colony had any just right to dispose of any lands conquered from the natives unless it was a just cause. As a result of this claim to property rights by conquest virtually died out after the 17th century. And then a third theory that we're going to look at is the early settlers' justification to occupying Indian lands was that the Indian themselves did not claim any property rights. An earlier settler reported that the land was a desert wilderness replete with only the kind of savage people and overgrown trees. Some claimed that the Indians were a wild people that had no laws to govern themselves. They were a people lacking any concern of property. They hold all things common except their wives. But statements like these were ignorant and nonsense, springing from armchair reporters looking to sell sensational stories back home. And they would draw upon their observation of distant lands, wild with savages and primitive people. The natives, just like other peoples, recognized property rights in their food, their clothing, housing, and the like. The details of their property systems varied greatly across the cultures across the land. And the differences between the English and the native system could be large, but it was clear to anyone of first-hand knowledge of the native that they possessed property. All my information is coming from these books, okay? I read them all. This is The Earth Shall Weep. And, you know, I got highlights and highlights of sections that I will be relating to you guys. This one is how the Indians lost their land. Again, everything, I highlighted a lot of stuff in here that I do all the work and I bring it to you. And of course, what can a good study be without a book for dummies, right? Native American History for Dummies. And then to top it off, which has some good information, is A Terrible Glory. Now, the last thing I want to say is the proper terms to be used for Indians, because Indians is not a correct term, and I do use it, but I really try not to. There was a census taken, and it's still a debate today, but there was a census taken in the U.S. what the natives wanted to be called, and 49% voted that they would rather be called American Indians. 37% said they'd rather be called American Natives. So I will be using American Indians and American Natives probably most of the time.